Have you heard of MCT oil and how some people will say, well, that gets you in a state of ketosis without fasting? Welcome to the Revo Report. We're inspiring faith with reason and reason with faith.
Yes. So, I mean, there's definitely benefits to just being in ketosis. So people are on a ketogenic diet. They're basically only eating meat and fat. And MCT oil is just a type of fat. It's supposed to be insulin, friendly, so you don't get as big of a boost, insulin release, I should say, when you consume fat, and specifically MCT oil. I'm not trying to say that that's not a worthy thing to do, but it's not pure intermittent fasting. And I'm speaking to people in India. I'm speaking to people in Guatemala. I'm speaking to people all over the world that might not have access to those particular oils and supplements. And so let me give you the short version, because, when you're an ER doc, you just want the biggest return on investment. You don't want diminishing returns. I want you just to get 95% of what you're supposed to. And so that's one of the things. But there are people that will throw some MCT oil in the mornings to help with their coffee. Personally, I think it's kind of gaming it a little bit. And I'm not saying there isn't benefit, but if you're a purist on the 0-calorie part, I don't think there's any downside to it. Now, if you're a person that says, hey, I just can't go 18 hours without some MCT oil in my coffee throughout the day, I might just say, you know what, we've gotten you so far. You're doing pretty good. You just keep doing what you have to. But if you want even more benefit, then drop the calories and use the MCT oil when you're in your eating window instead.
Okay, gotcha. And what about, I want to ask this, you don't have to answer this if you don't want to. If it's a too personal question, but do your kids fast? Because you were talking about 7 years old. Do your kids fast? And what would you say to someone saying, hey, how could kids fast? They're still growing, they're still developing, they get the calories.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say three things on this. One is that, and again, I'm just saying this just to prove the point, but I'm a 6'3" something guy, 272 pounds, unfortunately. And I've been fasting since I was 7. Since I was 7, I didn't lose inches. I didn't become everything worked out. Everything worked out. But with that said, though, I still keep that tradition going. So every one of my children since the age of 7 has been fasting. Now, they are not necessarily intermittent fasting for kids. I don't recommend them going more than 12 hours in a day. But I do think they should do the plant-based food. And when I say this, you guys have to keep in mind, as an Orthodox Christian, we spend like 180 to 200 days a year in this fasted state, sort of in different cycles. So I do take them along for the ride. Wednesdays and Fridays, 48 days leading up to Easter, 40 some days leading up to Christmas, certain fasting schedules throughout the summer. We have a health crisis. There are 10-year-olds now that are so obese that the new standard is to check them to make sure they don't have high cholesterol. We are seeing heart attacks in people in their 20s. That was unheard of. You were talking to an ER doc that trained in the 70s, and you're a 25-year-old with chest pain. He's rolling his eyes before he even goes into the room, being like, oh my gosh, like, what is this person doing here at 3 a.m? However, in the modern day, that might not be a ridiculous thing anymore. There are plenty of people at a young age, we've never seen it before, that are having heart attacks in their 20s. They're developing diabetes, and it's not type 1 diabetes, but type 2 diabetes at a very young age. It's all diet and cultural induced. And so I bring this up to say that I think that we have a healthcare crisis in America that's so systemic and so deep that I think even a child as young as 7 in this pathway would do well by cleaning up their diet. There's something really important to bring up, though. And this is the thing. There was this study done called the ACE study, and they followed tens of thousands of children throughout their lives. And they noticed there was a certain cohort of them that were living 20 years less. They were homeless. They were addicted to drugs. They got divorced. They couldn't keep a job. They had all sorts of health problems, diabetes, high cholesterol, stroke, etc. What the hell happened? And what they recognized was that these children had these events called the adverse childhood events. That as few as 3 or 4 of these, I believe was the magic number, if they so much as witnessed assault, were victims of assault, were in that world of drugs and alcohol, were violently abused, were neglected, that they were almost destined. They were almost destined to live less long from all these different problems. And what that tells me is, one, we need to really protect our children, because so much that occurs in their formative years literally then cascades. It's almost impossible to prevent later on. But what it also tells me is that if a lot of harm and suffering and neglect can rob a child of 20 years, what can love and attention and support, and I would say fasting with these concepts of sacrifice and delayed gratification discipline, what years can I add to their lives at a young age? So I just bring this up to say that when we talk about fasting, let's not leave any money on the table. I think that if there's any time in life for a child to really inculcate these rules into their lives, it's got to be when they're young. It's got to be when they're young, and they're going to sidestep a tsunami of problems of addiction and abuse and divorce and all those things I mentioned to you later on as a result. Again, it's God salve the suffering.
Wow. I'm not, to be honest, I had 20 questions for you and I'm at 5 right now just because I'm so interested in everything you've been saying, man. And
Great.
I actually have to pick up my wife in
no problem.
I gotta leave here. But whoa, I'm blown away by this. I've watched a few of your interviews. I love how well articulate you are, and you've obviously studied this and lived it out as well. Can we have a part 2 of this?
Absolutely. And you know, what's really cool, again, it's no coincidence that as we talk about fasting, we weave into sort of the philosophical and sort of the scientific. It is the coolest little specialization that bridges both worlds. And so as a result, it's like we could talk about the science, but then like, oh my God, I can't believe that the sympathetic nervous system allows us to solve ADHD and anxiety and the spiritual thing. And so it's very interconnected. And so by all means, Vince, I'm just honored to be on your podcast in general, but let's have part 2 or more in the future. No problem at all. I got 4 kids. I know the reality of picking people up. I'm like a ER doc during the day and a taxi driver in the evening. No doubt.
This work is incredible. It's something that I really need to look into because I've been doing intermittent fasting. We do fasting at our church. We do 2 fasting schedules throughout the year. And I want to look into, doing it at specific times, specific days in the week, and even talking to, our parishioners about it as well. You're just a few hours away from us. I'd like to also extend an invite. If ever you are in the area, come speak at our church about this, share your book if you're willing, because I think, man, people will really benefit from this, especially the knowledge you have, your ability to articulate it, and also just your passion and living it out. So that's incredible, man. I hate to cut it short.
But no worries. I'm long-winded. But no, thank you, Vince. I really appreciate it. And sorry for any of the technological issues here, but I'll make sure my internet connection is a little stronger next time too.
I know that your title with Anton was, I think he titled it the Jesus Diet. I want to ask this one last question, if I could, before we close off. Is there historical evidence, or at least in your studies that you've done, that the Athos diet is, because of the Orthodox tradition and very close to going back to the church fathers, to the early church traditions, is there evidence that you've seen that this is actually the diet probably of Jesus or probably of the early disciples and the apostles?
I would argue that it probably does mimic it. I don't believe necessarily that Jesus, and I'm only bringing this up because some people will watch this and be like, oh, was Jesus sort of, the greatest good was to prevent animals from being slaughtered. I mean, that was a nice second order effect of being, plant-based, but I don't think that was his highest good in terms of why he was fasting. So I just put that out there. But what I will say, though, is that I do believe there's plenty of, evidence in the literature, in the canons of the church, as to like bishops and priests are not allowed to slaughter animals, by the way. Monks in the Orthodox Church never eat meat. They can have, at best, dairy and eggs, and then it's all plant-based, and then they go vegan for these other more significant parts of the year. So all of that gives me breadcrumbs to believe that they're practicing a tradition that mimics something that was developed very early on. And again, this is based on readings from various fathers that I've been quoting. But they all seem to resonate with this idea of a plant-based diet, sort of oscillating throughout the year and really limiting the amount of hours that they eat. Something like 1 meal a day, or perhaps in the case of other parts of the year where there's communion and a meal, etc., maybe it's many as 8 hours, but probably not more than that.